Jean-Claude Van Damme was once known as the Muscles from Brussels, a man who made the world hold its breath with his incredible martial arts skills. He played unforgettable characters like Frank Dux in Bloodsport and the twins in Double Impact. He wasn't just another action star. He was a phenomenon who captured hearts in the 1980s and 1990s with his amazing splits and powerful kicks. His name became legendary around the world. But behind all the fame and applause were deep wounds that never fully healed. Van Damme went through 5 broken marriages, faced terrible betrayals, struggled with serious drug addiction, and dealt with scandals that nearly destroyed his reputation. Even now, at 63 years old, he still carries scars from battles that were much harder than any movie role he ever played. Jean-Claude Camille François van Varenberg was born on October 18, 1960, in Berchem-Saint-Agathe, a quiet area near Brussels, Belgium. His father, Eugene, was an accountant who kept things organized with numbers, while his mother, Eliana, was a florist who filled their small home with beautiful flowers. His sister, Veronique, was his only sibling and companion during childhood. On the surface, life seemed normal for young Jean-Claude, but when he looked in the mirror, he saw something that broke his heart. A skinny boy with thick glasses who was constantly mocked by other children as puny Four Eyes. He was a dreamer trapped inside a body that seemed too weak to carry his big dreams. At age 11, he stood staring at his reflection and felt the sharp pain of being laughed at. That day, he made a promise to himself that he would rewrite his own story. His first real battles weren't fought in any ring, but inside his own heart against ridicule, doubt, and the heavy silence that hurt more than words ever could. His father, seeing the storm brewing inside his son, enrolled him at the Centre National de Karaté in Brussels under Master Claude Goetz. For 4 brutal years, Jean-Claude trained until discipline became as natural as breathing. By age 18, he had earned a black belt in Shotokan Karate and joined Belgium's national team. He was finally learning how to turn shame into strength and fear into focus. But physical strength alone wasn't enough for Jean-Claude. Despite people making fun of him, he chose to study ballet. For 5 demanding years, he worked at the ballet bar, building balance, grace, and endurance beyond what most people could imagine. Ballet is the hardest, he would say years later. If you can survive a ballet workout, you can survive anything. To complete his transformation, he also turned to bodybuilding, reshaping his once fragile body into a figure of steel. In 1978, the world took notice when he won the title of Mr. Belgium. Yet the trophies meant less to him than what he had won inside himself, true belief in his abilities. Around age 12, one restless night, Jean-Claude had walked alone into a church and whispered 3 wishes that seemed impossible at the time. He wanted to save the world, protect nature, and become a movie star. These might have seemed naive to others, but to a lonely boy desperate for hope, they were lifelines. These early battles, heartbreaking and cruel, yet somehow beautiful, carved themselves deep into his soul, preparing him for a destiny larger than he could have ever imagined. Jean-Claude left Belgium with muscles built through karate, ballet, and bodybuilding, but all that physical strength couldn't protect him from what waited in America. In 1982, carrying only $3,000, a thick accent that people laughed at, and a dream bigger than his own body, Jean-Claude landed in the United States with his friend Michel Kesey. Hollywood seemed like it was a million miles away, and he was just another unknown immigrant staring at a city that didn't care whether he lived or died. Many nights found him curled up in the back seat of a beaten-up car. The seats were torn, the windows fogged up with his own breath, and his stomach twisted so badly with hunger that sleep became impossible. He later admitted that sometimes he stole food, an apple here, a sandwich there, not because he wanted to be a thief, but because he was desperate. It was the kind of desperation that eats at your bones until you feel completely empty inside. Days turned into weeks of walking the streets, knocking on studio doors, only to have them slammed shut again and again. Some say he went to more than 100 auditions, and each one ended the same way, with a polite smile, a shake of the head, or worse, laughter at the way his tongue stumbled over English words. Every rejection felt like a knife cutting into him. The silence of his phone afterward wasn't just quiet. It was like a judge's verdict that maybe he would never belong in this world. Yet every morning, Even with an empty stomach, he forced himself to stretch, to train, to do his splits until the pain screamed through his legs. "All the time, I believed in my head that my dream would happen," he later said. "Every day I said, 'Thank you in advance for my success.'" He admitted it seemed like madness to keep believing, but belief was all he had left. To survive, Jean-Claude worked any job that would hire him. He delivered pizzas, laid floors, drove limousines, and even worked as a bouncer at Chuck Norris's bar called Woody's Wharf. The irony cut deep, protecting strangers at night while dreaming of fighting villains on the silver screen. Still, he kept showing up, kept offering his skills and his smile, certain that one day someone would finally notice him. In 1984, he appeared briefly in the movie Break-In as a background dancer, but his amazing splits went unnoticed by most people watching. That same year, he joined Chuck Norris's stunt team in Missing in Action, a job that paid almost nothing but proved he could bleed for the camera if needed. His first real break didn't come easily. Only in 1986 did he finally get a role with a face and a name, playing the Russian villain Ivan in No Retreat, No Surrender. It was a small film made cheaply, but it felt like victory tasting like sunlight after years of rain. He was no longer just a hungry boy sleeping in a car. He was finally on screen. These years were not glamorous at all. They were brutal, with poverty, humiliation, and crushing loneliness as his daily companions. But from the depths of that struggle came the toughness that would later make him famous as the Muscles from Brussels. Every rejection was a wound. Every night in that car left a scar. Yet each one became part of the fabric of a legend in the making. In 1988, after years of sleeping in cars, stealing food to survive, and walking out of casting rooms after being mocked for his accent, after more than 100 humiliating rejections telling him he would never belong, the world finally looked his way. Bloodsport hit movie theaters, and with it, Jean-Claude Van Damme exploded into legend. On screen, he played Frank Dux fighting in a hidden tournament, but in reality, he was fighting for every cold night, every slammed door, every insult that had made him feel invisible. Made for just $1.5 million, the film became a global sensation, and The Immigrant with Broken English became the obsession of action movie fans everywhere. Later, he would say with tears in his eyes, "When Bloodsport came out, I cried because the little boy in Belgium was finally seen." The applause was thunderous. The lights were blinding, and for the first time in his life, he was no longer a ghost. Success didn't arrive gently. It crashed down like a tidal wave. Kickboxer turned a modest budget into a $50 million triumph, forever showing the world the image of a drunken dance that exploded into a split kick. More films followed quickly, Lionheart and Death Warrant, each one proving he was no passing fad. Double Impact doubled his legend, showing Van Damme fighting against Van Damme in a dazzling display of grace and toughness. Then Universal Soldier brought him face-to-face with Dolph Lundgren in a brutal clash that earned more than $100 million worldwide and crowned him a global phenomenon. The peak came with Time Cop, which made more than $100 million at the box office. Critics were silenced as his character Max Walker showed that Van Damme could not only break bones but also break hearts with his acting. For a brief moment, the world saw the sensitive dreamer behind the fighter. Even video games bowed to his influence. Mortal Kombat's Johnny Cage was designed to look like him, complete with his initials and swagger. Jean-Claude Van Damme wasn't just starring in Hollywood movies anymore. He was reshaping the entire action movie industry. But a cruel irony was already bleeding through all the glamour. The dream that had once lifted him from hunger and humiliation was now chaining him with golden shackles. Later, Van Damme admitted with tired honesty, "I was working too much, flying from set to set, exhausted. I couldn't see my family." Stardom had saved him once, but now it was eating him alive piece by piece. The endless schedule left him bruised before the next camera even started rolling. City after city blurred together into one endless movie set, with applause echoing louder than his own heartbeat. Behind his million-dollar smile, his eyes grew dark with shadows that no makeup could hide. At home, the cheers of millions couldn't fill the silence. Ints of his own dinner table, where empty chairs spoke louder than any applause. His marriages were falling apart, his children felt his absence, and on movie sets, people began whispering about late arrivals and nights blurred by too much drinking. The image emerged of a man running from an exhaustion deeper than his body could handle. The very success that had lifted him out of that freezing car seat was now pressing on his shoulders like a weight with no mercy. Fame, once his greatest friend, had turned into a master with no compassion, no brakes, and no understanding. He had climbed the mountain he once prayed for as a trembling boy in that Belgian church. But every mountain casts a shadow, and in that shadow, darker battles were waiting. Battles that no fight choreography could plan, no spotlight could soften, and no applause could ever help him win. Perhaps the most brutal battle of all lies in matters of the heart. In 1980, at just 20 years old, Jean-Claude married Maria Rodriguez, a woman who offered him stability and tenderness in the quiet life of Belgium. For a short while, their marriage seemed to anchor him, reminding him that beyond trophies, training, and restless ambition, there could also be warmth and love. But Jean-Claude's eyes were fixed on a horizon far beyond Brussels. Hollywood's lights shimmered in his imagination with a promise too loud to ignore. When he chose to leave Europe in 1982 with little more than a suitcase and a dream, Maria was left behind. It wasn't out of cruelty, but because his path seemed to have room for only one person. Their marriage, lasting only 4 years and never blessed with children, fell apart under the strain of distance, absence, and a dream that demanded everything. Maria would later describe life with him as unbearable, like loving someone meant standing in the middle of a storm she couldn't control. For Jean-Claude, the realization came later, heavy and unshakable. It was the first wound my dream left on someone I loved. His first step toward Hollywood had been built on heartbreak. That marriage, young and fragile, became the first sacrifice at the altar of his ambition. It was a bitter lesson written in silence and separation, that every prayer whispered in that Belgian church for stardom and glory would carry with it a hidden cost. After leaving behind his first marriage in Belgium and chasing his dream across the ocean with only $3,000 in his pocket, Jean-Claude survived in Los Angeles with odd jobs as a bouncer and pizza delivery boy. It was there that he met Cynthia Derderian, a young woman from a wealthy American family who seemed to represent the stability and comfort he had abandoned when he left Europe. To many people, their wedding in 1985 looked like a happy second chance for a man finally climbing toward his dream. The muscles from Brussels, once mocked as puny Four Eyes, was now marrying into privilege and love in the very city he longed to conquer. For a brief moment, it seemed he had found balance, the warmth of a home to counter the harsh lights of Hollywood. But reality was much harsher. Hollywood's lights dazzled him completely. The promise of stardom roared louder than the quiet wedding vows he had just spoken. Jean-Claude was consumed by a single obsession, to make it no matter what the cost. That hunger, the same fire that had once saved him, now became a merciless master at home. Cynthia would later sum up her pain in one devastating confession. Living with Van Damme was hell because he only loved himself. Her words cut like a blade, exposing the truth he couldn't deny. His drive for glory was slowly strangling the love he had found. Their marriage, fragile and rushed, lasted just 1 year. There were no children to bind them to death, or only the echo of what could have been. For Van Damme, this was more than just a divorce. It was the first brutal sign that his dream was already demanding blood sacrifices. He had escaped poverty and the sneers that once crushed his spirit, but in chasing Hollywood's shimmering promise, he was losing something even more precious: the simple chance at a home, a family, and love that could last. At the peak of his meteoric rise, when Hollywood lights burned brighter than ever, Jean-Claude Van Damme seemed untouchable. But life has a way of striking where armor is thinnest. In 1987, still soaring from the triumph of Bloodsport, he married Gladys Portugues, a former bodybuilder and fitness champion whose strength matched her warmth. For the first time, he felt the fragile possibility of a real home. Their son Christopher was born that same year, and in 1990, their daughter Bianca arrived on Van Damme's own birthday, an almost poetic gift, as if fate was rewarding the boy who had once prayed at 12 years old in a quiet Belgian church for family, purpose, and a future under the lights. To the world, Van Damme was now both an action icon and a family man, living the complete dream. But behind the glossy magazine covers, cracks began splitting the foundation. Hollywood demanded everything: his time, his body, his soul. The demanding schedules left him broken and absent from home, And in those empty spaces, temptation crept in. Worse still, his own choices carved wounds deeper than any opponent's strike. Rumors of cheating surfaced, betrayals that cut far deeper than any roundhouse kick he had ever delivered on screen. For Gladys, it became unbearable. The strong woman who had stood by his side, given him 2 children, and offered him the stability he had once begged God for, suddenly found herself betrayed. After 5 years together, their marriage collapsed in 1992, and the woman who had been his anchor walked away, taking with her the laughter of their children that had once filled their home. For Van Damme, it was a devastating blow, a heartbreak that reminded him of a truth he couldn't escape. No matter how many millions he earned, no matter how loudly the world cheered, the cost of his dream was the very love he had once prayed to protect. Years later, he would look back on that loss with rare softness in his voice, admitting how much pain it caused to see his children grow up without him there. The man who could break bricks with a kick discovered that the most shattering blow wasn't on screen. It was watching the family he had dreamed of slip through his fingers. The echoes of his broken marriages had barely faded when he sought comfort once again, this time in the arms of Darcy Lapierre, a radiant former Miss Hawaii, whose beauty and promise of stability seemed to offer him the peace he had been chasing since Belgium. In 1994, beneath the tropical skies of Bangkok, they married, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if he had finally grasped the life he once prayed for as a trembling boy in that church pew: fame, family, and now the fragile hope of redemption. A year later, their son Nicholas was born, and his first cry should have been the purest answer to those prayers, the sound of a second chance, living proof that perhaps all the sacrifices had not been in vain. But the storm inside Van Damme had not passed. It was only gathering force. Hollywood's temptations screamed louder with every premiere, every after-party, every hotel room where loneliness collided with fame. Soon tabloids were on fire with rumors. An alleged affair with pop star Kylie Minogue during the filming of Street Fighter. Whispers of another relationship with model Isabella Fortea. The headlines didn't just feed gossip. They reflected the same betrayals that had already torn apart his bond with Gladys. For Darcy, proud and young, the hurt was unbearable. A woman who had given, and him a son, was suddenly left questioning whether love was ever enough to compete with fame's hunger. The marriage, already shaking, fell apart in a blaze of cameras and bitter accusations. Darcy publicly accused Van Damme of being unpredictable, of having a love that could not protect, but only wound. By 1997, it was over, and their separation became one of the most public scandals of his life. Yet, the deepest wound wasn't the loss of another wife or even the humiliation of headlines. It was Nicholas. When custody was taken from him, Van Damme discovered a silence more cruel than any critic's review. The silence of a home where a child's laughter had been replaced by absence. Years later, his voice would crack when he confessed, "Not seeing my son, it broke me." For a man who had survived poverty, humiliation, addiction, and ridicule, this was the blow that truly shattered him. He could break bricks with a single kick, but he couldn't break the wall that now stood between him and his boy. What remained was the cruelest irony. While display cases filled with trophies, his house grew emptier. While magazines called him a legend, his legacy at home was written in absence. Losing Nicholas left a wound no trophy could cover, and into that emptiness crept shadows darker than any opponent Jean-Claude Van Damme had ever faced. The man who once split the sky with his kicks now found himself fighting an enemy that lived inside his veins, his mind, his soul. By the early 1990s, whispers about drugs had already followed him, but after the collapse of his fourth marriage, those whispers became screams. Some reports claimed he was using up to 10 grams of cocaine a day, an amount that could kill a weaker man. His body, once sculpted like steel, now carried the slow rust of despair. Years later, stripped of all bravado, he would admit softly, "I thought I was invincible. I was using too much. I was losing myself." On the set of Street Fighter in 1994, the lights blazed, costumes shimmered, and cameras demanded perfection. Yet behind the scenes, chaos brewed. Van Damme would disappear for days at a time, pulled into the undertow of addiction. The film made money, but for those who watched him stumble, it was clear that the man Hollywood had hailed as unstoppable was burning out frame by frame. Legal troubles came next, turning private pain into public shame. A stunt accident left Jackson Pinckney blind in one eye, and nearly $500,000 was ordered in settlement. But the true cost was carved into Van Damme's conscience, a mistake no action scene could undo. Then in 1997, Frank Dux, the very martial artist whose story had made him famous, dragged him into court over claims of a stolen script. Though Van Damme won the case, the headlines told another story of betrayal, greed, and a fallen hero. The blows kept landing. That same year, in a crowded New York bar, biker and actor Chuck Zito knocked him down in front of witnesses. For the man who had defeated giants on screen, the humiliation of being struck down in public became tabloid news worldwide. Each headline was another cut, bleeding away the myth of being unbeatable. Hollywood, once eager to crown him king, began to pull back. At his peak, Van Damme had demanded $20 million per picture, rivaling Jim Carrey's salary. Studios refused, contracts slipped away, and the word blacklisted crept in like a death sentence. The tidal wave of stardom receded, leaving him stranded in silence. And in that silence, the abyss opened wide. Alone in a Hong Kong hotel room, Van Damme admitted he thought about ending it all. The boy who had once prayed in a Belgian church for purpose and glory now stared into nothingness, ready to surrender. No fight choreography could script this moment. No applause could drown out the sound of his own despair. By 1999, the spiral led him into flashing police lights when he was arrested for driving under the influence. A mugshot replaced the glossy posters of his prime. For fans, it was unthinkable. For Van Damme, it was proof that the hero they adored was gone, leaving only a ghost stumbling through the ruins of his own legend. The fall had been brutal, but what made it unbearable was the truth no headline could capture. Jean-Claude Van Damme wasn't just fighting the world outside, but a storm inside his own mind. In the late 1990s, doctors finally put a name to the chaos: bipolar disorder. For years, he had been swinging between extremes. Manic bursts where he could train 20 hours straight without sleep, convinced he was unstoppable, followed by crushing lows so deep that getting out of bed felt like lifting a mountain. Addiction had only poured fuel on that fire, dragging him deeper into cycles of extreme highs and devastating lows. Beneath all the spotlight and fame, it wasn't just his choices, but an illness that had been quietly controlling his life. The diagnosis was like a double-edged sword, devastating in what it revealed, but liberating in what it explained. It gave reason to the chaos that had cost him marriages, friendships, and nearly his career. But it also gave him a chance to fight back. The battle for recovery began with medication to calm the chemical storms in his brain, paired with therapy that forced him to confront the shadows he had long avoided. Then came the return to discipline. The same ballet, karate, and bodybuilding that had once transformed a fragile boy into a fighter. Now they weren't about preparing for the next movie, they were about survival itself. Every stretch, every kick, every drop of sweat became a prayer, a plea to reclaim the man he was losing. Recovery was no heroic movie montage. It was nights of shaking, days of doubt, weeks where giving up felt easier than enduring. He stumbled, he relapsed, he suffered in silence. But each time he forced himself back up. Slowly, painfully, he broke free from the chains of addiction. By the early 2000s, Van Damme had left drugs behind, and with steady treatment, his bipolar disorder came under control. Not cured, but managed, allowing him to live, work, and love again. Without discipline, he later confessed, I would not have survived. The man once celebrated for breaking bricks with his legs was now learning to rebuild himself piece by fragile piece. And in that fight, something unexpected happened. By speaking about his mental illness openly, by admitting he wasn't invincible, Van Damme broke another barrier, not in a martial arts studio or on a movie set, but in the stigma surrounding mental health. For fans who had once seen him as untouchable, His honesty became a lifeline. It told them that strength isn't the absence of weakness, but the courage to face it head-on. Jean-Claude Van Damme had faced the abyss and walked back from it. His body bore scars, his mind carried shadows, but his spirit proved unbroken. The hardest battles he had shown are not fought in tournaments or on screens. They're fought in silence within the self. And in surviving them, he discovered a victory greater than any box office success. Proof that redemption is real, recovery is possible, and even legends are human. From the ruins of scandal and despair, when Hollywood had all but written his obituary, Jean-Claude Van Damme began to rise again, not with a kick, but with a confession. In 2008, in the film JCVD, he stepped out of the myth and into raw humanity, breaking the fourth wall in a 6-minute speech that ended with him crying openly on camera. For the first time, audiences weren't watching the muscles from Brussels, the indestructible fighter, or the action star. They were watching a broken man begging to be understood. It wasn't choreographed action. It was truth. Time magazine called it Oscar-worthy, and millions called it unforgettable. That moment wasn't just a performance, it was a resurrection, the first flicker of light after years of darkness. What followed weren't just films, but fragments of a soul returning. Universal Soldier, Regeneration, in 2009, and Day of Reckoning in 2012 rekindled the flame of his legacy, proving the warrior still lived within him. In The Expendables 2 in 2012, he strutted onto the screen as a villain so magnetic that critics whispered, "Van Damme never left." Statues began to rise in Brussels, Azerbaijan, and Munich, not to celebrate the scandals, but to honor the symbol of a man who had turned a split kick into immortality. In 2013, a Volvo truck commercial swept the world and went viral. There he was, balanced between two moving trucks, legs stretched in a perfect split, his body pure poetry in motion, his spirit defying time itself. Even in 2016 and 2017 with Jean-Claude Van Johnson, he laughed at himself, transforming his own legend into comedy and winning applause not for his strength, but for his humility. This wasn't just a comeback, it was complete reinvention. Yet the truest act of resurrection didn't unfold under studio lights, but within the fragile chamber of his own heart. In 1999, battered and lost, he returned to the woman he had betrayed but never stopped loving, Gladys Portuguese. She had given him 2 children, Christopher and Bianca, and more than that, she had given him the one thing Hollywood could never provide, a real home. Their reunion was no fairy tale. It was a battle for forgiveness, a daily choice to heal what fame had shattered. Even in 2015, when divorce papers once more threatened to close their chapter, they chose love over pride, reconciliation over ruin. Today, she remains not as a shadow of his fame, but as the lighthouse that pulled him back from the abyss, the love that saved him from himself. This, above all, was the resurrection that mattered, not box office new, embers or bronze statues, but the rediscovery of family, forgiveness, and the quiet, defiant power of love.